Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Quinn Arntsen. I'm a partner at Farella, Braun, and Martel. I am a real estate attorney. Most of my practice is kind of traditional commercial real estate, but in addition to that, I do quite a bit of wine industry work, mostly real estate, so buying and selling vineyards, leasing vineyards, great purchases agreements, easements, things like that. Our first panelist today is Christopher Thompson. Christopher is the president of the board of directors at Napa Firewise. He's also a firefighter with the Napa County Fire Department at the Deer Park Station. He lives up in Angwin, I believe. And Christopher, Deer Park, that makes sense. He was named Firefighter of the Year in 2017. Our second panelist is MaryJo Lopez. She's an associate at Farella, Braun, and Martel who focuses on litigation and wine industry matters. She graduated from Stanford Law School in 2020 and from Stanford University with honors in 2015. And with that, I'll let Christopher take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let me know if you can hear me okay. We're going to get started. I'm going to talk about defensible space, home hardening. I'm going to talk a little bit about the NCFF so everybody's familiar with what we do, why we do it, what we've accomplished. And happy to take questions at the end. I want to, though, say that the NCFF, Napa Communities, Firewise Foundation, NCFF, we're about fire prevention. We're not about fire suppression. So the difference being that we are about removing fuels that feed fire. But once the fire starts, that's about fire suppression. That's apparatus, fire engines, helicopters, airplanes, and so forth. And so we're not going to get into that. That's not my area of expertise, even though I am a firefighter. So let's go ahead and get started here with our slides. So Napa Communities Firewise Foundation, NCFF for short. We have 12 fire safe councils. We are going to be probably about 15 in the not too distant future, which then represents about 30,000 of the county's constituents. I started on the board in 2017. We had 8 fire safe councils. So we've done a lot of growing and a lot of educating and a lot of outreach, which is what our mission is. We are also, our mission is to raise funds through grants, and we'll get into that a little bit more here in the slideshow. We recently released the countywide CWPP. So that's a community wildfire protection plan. That's a map that tells us what's going on in the county in terms of fuel loading, areas that need to be attacked in terms of removing that fuel, why we're doing it. We have this wonderful map now on our NCFF website, and it explains what the CWPP is. And you can go into that and look at where you live, what projects have been designated for that area. We have money now from the county, and we will be doing work across the entire county. So all areas of the county are going to be paid attention to. We recently have had a commitment made to us from the county of $6.4 million. That we received after my presentation in April 6th. By the end of April, we had $1 million that we were spending boots on the ground in the Circle Oaks area and Angwin roadside fuel mitigation work. So we got to work very quickly. Our goal is to make sure that we are low overhead, that we get the money that we get, that we put it to use for the purposes of fuel mitigation. And we're not interested in building a large bureaucracy as an organization. In the last 3 months, we've spent that $1 million. We have another $5.4 million that will drop in the second fiscal year, which will be probably about August 1st. And we have a 5-year plan. And that first year of that 5-year plan, what we have not done thus far starts on or about August 1st. And you can go onto our website and look at the 5-year plan, look at the first year and see what the projects are. In addition to that, we have $1 million that we received from the California Fire Safe Council to help underserved communities deal with defensible space. And we're doing that right now into Berryessa's, the estates in the Highlands. And we have $11 million of fire protection grants outstanding right now, waiting to hear from CAL FIRE. We are getting indications, very positive indications, that at least one of those grants, the Forest Health Grant, is looking very likely that we'll get that, knock on wood. And that is about $5 million, and that is to treat over 1,000 acres of forested area in the Angwin Pacific Union College area. So let's go ahead and on to the next slide. So this is something that I like people to think about when we are all familiar with tornado warnings. We know when there's a tornado warning, not that we'd ever have a tornado warning here, but we've all heard that when there's a tornado warning, what to do. And what we're trying to get people to do is to have that same reflex, have that same reaction to a red flag warning. So when you have a red flag warning, we want you to change your attitude, your posture, and the things that you're doing in the course of your daily routine. Next slide. So we want you to fill up your car with fuel. We want you to point your car away from the house so you have quick egress, unlock your gate, disengage your garage door from the automatic opener, cycle your generator if you have one, check hoses, water supply, remove flammable materials from around your home on your porch, make sure there's no stacked wood, make sure there's no debris in the gutters, on the valleys of the roof lines. Basically assume, if we have a red flag warning, that the potential for fire is extremely high, and thus the potential for a PSPS, public safety power shutdown, is also extremely high. So what I'm associating with the tornado warning, I'm now saying when you see a red flag, understand that we need to function differently in our day-to-day chores and activities. Next slide. So what does it take for fire? It takes oxygen, it takes heat, and it takes fuel. The only thing you have control over as a homeowner or a business owner or a winery owner is the fuel component of that. And so when we talk about defensible space, what we're talking about is removing the fuel. And what that equates to is, if you want to change fire behavior, you have to change the fuel that feeds the fire. If you want to change fire behavior that is potentially encroaching in a community, you put a fuel break around that community. You're removing the fuels around the community so that encroaching fire does not have the fuel to feed. If you want to change fire behavior around your home, you remove the fuels from around your home. Should a fire occur around your home, it starts to encroach on your home, that fuel is no longer there, then the fire can be dealt with. Next slide. So one of the things that changes all equations, no matter what we talk about, is the issue of wind, the north winds that we talk about here. So as a firefighter, we have vegetation fires all the time, and they are not intimidating. What becomes intimidating is when we have a vegetation fire and we have a north wind at the same time. The north winds are because of a high pressure in the Nevada basin. And as that high pressure moves across our mountain ranges, those mountain canyons act as a way of compressing the air that goes through them. And when the air is released into the valley floor, it is superheated and it is moving very quickly. So think of a garden hose. When you pinch a garden hose, the water leaving that pinch point has to equal the water coming into it. And so the air coming into a mountain range has to equal the air coming out of a mountain range. So therefore, when it moves through those canyons, it has to speed up. So one side balances with the other. And that energy is released into our valley. And that is where we get our Diablo winds. It comes in a very warm and arid. It enters the valley, and we have very low relative humidity, and we have these high winds. And so should a fire occur, those winds fan that fire, and it is almost impossible to fight that fire if it crowns into the forest. And so we'll talk about that here in a second. Go to the next slide, please. When the fire moves from the ground into a tree canopy, it has to have a way of doing that, and we call that ladder fuel. And so the ladder fuel is the fuel that grows up around the base of the tree. So a ground fire sneaks along the ground, it reaches that ladder fuel, ladders up into the canopy of the tree, and then the trees torch. And where we really get into trouble is if those trees are conifers, if they are gray pines, if they are Douglas fir, things of that nature with a lot of oil, a lot of fuel. Those trees then create a lot of ember. Next slide. Those embers are like little pellets, size of a marble. They don't look, holding in your hand might not look like much. Next slide. But this is what we firefighters face when we have ember cast. And when we had the glass fire, it was the ember cast that did the most damage. It is the ember cast that got from the Deer Park area over to Spring Mountain. It's the ember cast that when it came over the Devil's Elbow or the hairpin turn on Deer Park Road, that's what lit off all of Deer Park. And I remember standing underneath that ember cast and watching those embers fly through the air. And it's just like little hand grenades going off all over the community. And once these embers land on fuel, because people haven't done their defensible space work, then you have a spot fire. And as a firefighter, you look at the situation and you have to triage what is possible. So if we have a home that's not been well cared for in terms of defensible space, and it looks like it's going to take too many resources, firefighters will turn away from that and go somewhere where they know they can do the work that's required because people have done the proper types of defensible space. Next slide. So these are the areas of a home. And of course, if some of you are business owners, it makes no difference. There are vulnerable places all around structures, whether dormers, gutters, underneath or within the valley of a roof line because debris has built up over the winter. Anything that can collect an ember as it flies through the air. And if there's a fuel source there, then that ember will land on it and it will ignite. Next slide. So here's an example of a dormer that overhangs the roof line such that debris can build up inside that area, and embers coming into that area will ignite that debris and ignite that roof line very quickly. Next slide. And this is what happens. This is debris that has gathered up against a dormer. Embers had landed on it, and now we've got direct contact between that fuel source and the structure of the house. Next slide. Next slide. So here, as we are all familiar with some of the vulnerable places of a home or a business structure, vent, this is required by the building code. These vents allow for air circulation in the eaves and the attic space. The problem is that the old-fashioned way of doing this, they had grating that was larger than 1/8 of an inch, and that's big enough to let these embers into the attic. Once that attic ignites, it's almost impossible to extinguish the flames in that house. So there are now vents being made by companies such as Vulcan Vents that will not only keep embers from entering the space, but if it detects heat, it will close. It will automatically shut off. Next slide. And this is what it looks like when you've got those vents in your eaves. This is what's actually happening. This is this air circulation that the building department wants. And this is exactly the air circulation that the fire department does not want. So that's why we now recommend that these vents be changed to keep these embers from entering that attic space. Next slide. We all have these, whether it's a barn, a house, or a business. Again, an opportunity to put in a Vulcan vent. Next slide. Crawl spaces. I see a lot of this. I toured through a number of homes just recently in the Silverado Highlands, where the Atlas Peak fire burned 152 homes. And I was astonished at how many of these homes don't have vents that have been properly used, improved upon rather, and then how many of these homes have beauty bark that's up against the house. And so imagine that an ember lands on this debris, it ignites the debris. Because you have cool air on the inside of the crawl space and warm air on the outside, you have convection. That means that air is pulling into the crawl space and it's going to suck in those embers. And once those embers enter the crawl space, whatever there is there for it to burn, it will ignite. Next slide. These dormers also a prime opportunity. If you have, as I continue to see, beauty bark, wood chips around the base of your home, embers land, you get a flame, the flame reaches the underside of those dormers. Those dormers are not fire proof or even fire resistant, and that then enters the building structure. Back one, there you go. So this is where we were talking about gutters, debris. That's an easy fix, putting gutter lids on the gutters. In my case, I removed all the gutters on my home and I just let the water roll off the house. And then I put stone where the water lands, and I put a French drain underneath that stone to draw that water in, and then I harvest that water. And so I don't have to worry anymore about the debris building up in my gutters or having to get up there and clean the gutters seasonally. Next slide. This is a mock-up of a house that was built in a very large testing facility where they are bombarding the house with an ember cast. And this is an example where you see ignitions occurring in the gutters where there's debris buildup, and you're seeing ignition in the perimeter footprint of the house where typically we have wood chips and other flammable material to decorate around the house. Recently, Napa County has changed the code where the 5-foot perimeter of a home can no longer have combustible material. I don't know exactly when that goes into effect, but that has changed as a result of the LNU complex fire and the glass fire. Next slide. Decks, overhangs. What I see here happening often is people will tuck seasonal equipment underneath their decks or underneath the deck overhangs. They'll put equipment there, they'll put lawn chairs, they'll put things that they're not using anymore. If that house lives at the top of a hill, fire likes to go up hills. It does so because as the fire moves up the hill, the radiant heat preheats the fuel that the fire is moving to. So by the time the live flame gets to that preheated area, it's very receptive to ignition. It moves up the hill, and if you have a house sitting on a ridge line or at the top of that hill, then that fire is going to then move into the underside of that deck. If there is materials stored on the underside of that deck, it will ignite, and then the fire will come up from underneath the deck. So what we're telling people is get that material out from the deck, and then make sure you have stone or other non-flammable material on the underside of the deck so that seasonal grass does not grow up underneath there and become a source of fuel. Next slide. Fence lines. We say that the fence is the wick to your home. And by that, and I have this example right here at my house where my neighbor had a fence just like this. He also had some Italian cypress trees lined up against the fence line. Those Italian cypress trees caught ember cast. They torched off like Roman candles. They ignited the fence. The fence caught fire, and the fire traveled along the fence until it met a structure, which happened to be an outbuilding. And ignited the outbuilding. So what you want to do if you're going to have a wood fence is you want to make sure there's a physical break between that fence and the structure that it comes in proximity to or directly attaches to. Next slide. Defensible space. We hear this over and over and over again. I worked hard at putting defensible space around my house. When the glass fire came through my property, I had a fire engine from Riverside County stationed at my property, and they did so unbeknownst to me, because I was out fighting fires elsewhere. They did so because I gave them a place to stage and to beat back the fire. Defensible space is not just protecting your home from the wildland, it's also protecting the wildland from your home. 86% of fires start in and around the home. If we have a home ignite, it's very possible that could turn into a veg fire, and that veg fire could turn into a wildland fire. So that defensible space serves multiple purposes. It gives the firefighters a place to stage, to beat back the fire. They protect your home, or they protect the wildland from your home, depending upon how the fire is started. So I've said this a number of times. There are, according to the 2010 census, there were 546 homes in Deer Park. If each one of those homes had a quarter of an acre of land and everybody had done the proper amount of defensible space, we would have had 250 acres of hardened defensible space in Deer Park. And I can tell you we did not have that. And consequently, we lost a lot of homes in Deer Park. So all the discussions about fuel mitigation in and around the community pales in comparison to what we can do as homeowners in doing the proper amount of defensible space, whether it's a home or whether it's a winery, whether it's a farm. It is much needed area of focus that all of us have to pay attention to. Next slide. So here we have that 5-foot rule that they're going to impose in the county soon. We have that 30-foot. In my situation, I have irrigated grass. I have irrigated plants. So it's a high moisture content within that 30 feet. If anything lands within that 30 feet, it's not going to ignite. The 5-foot, I made sure I had hardscaping, stones, pebbles, that sort of thing. And then the 100-foot, I had proper spacing between trees. I had the trees limbed up. I made sure there were no wood piles, things that could collect an ember and sit there and create embers in and of itself, like a pile of wood. Next slide. So this is what this is a different perspective of looking at that 5-foot, the 5 to 30, and then the 30 to 100. And when I said spacing the trees, what you're trying to do is, if one of the trees does ignite, you're trying to keep that fire from moving through the canopy. Next slide. So limbing up your trees, when I talked about the ladder fuel, what we're saying is that we want depending, if let's say, for example, you have a Douglas fir, and it's a beautiful Douglas fir, and let's say at the base of the Douglas fir you have a Japanese maple, it's a beautiful species, and you don't want to take that ladder fuel out, then we're saying you have to limb up the tree 3 times greater than the height of that ladder fuel. So we're not saying in all situations you have to remove ladder fuel. We're saying if there are situations where it's a way that you've landscaped your property and you want to keep that foliage at the base of the tree, then you have to limb the tree up. So should that foliage at the base of the tree ignite, then the chances of transferring that fire from that ladder fuel into the canopy is removed, or certainly that possibility is lessened. Next slide. And that 30-foot rule is really basically to keep radiant heat from igniting your home. As a firefighter, I saw many properties where just radiant heat alone, not from large trees that were torching off, was enough to ignite the home, because the heat just went through the windows into the house and ignited contents of the house. So having those trees away and having the distance properly done between the trees and limbed up is critical in situations where you're talking about radiant heat. Next slide. And then the type of foliage that you have. Again, when I was touring through Silverado Country Club, I saw juniper, I saw rosemary, I saw thyme, I saw all kinds of foliage that is highly flammable. And what this picture is to denote is that if you have juniper, if you have a high oil content type of conifer, you might as well be just putting little gasoline cans around your house. And I have pictures of properties where I went in as a firefighter and we saw many, many little bushes around the home just sitting there completely engulfed in flames because embers had landed on them and they were high content oil. And what's remarkable to me is that they're still allowing these types of plants to be put into communities where they're rebuilding after devastating fires. So our organization is trying to push the county to start changing landscape design rules so that this type of foliage is not put in within that ignition zone around homes. Next slide. This is just more of what we were talking about, removing trees that overhang your house, right? So if you have debris on your roof, in your gutter, that ignites, the flame reaches up into an overhanging branch that may be dead or have a lot of dry wood. That branch ignites, then the canopy ignites. Now you've got a very large fuel source over your home, and then you have a radiant heat issue that's very likely going to ignite the home. So removing these branches and pulling the canopies back away from the chimneys and from the roof line is critical. Next slide. And this is what we want to see, 10 feet from chimneys to foliage of a tree in proximity to the home. Next slide. You can do less than 10 feet, but we recommend 10 feet. So limbing trees up 10 feet from the ground. And so not that this is any place that any one of us wants to live, but this is a perfect example of a home that had defensible space done, and they were able to corral the fire such that it went around the home and not through the home. And my home survived. I have 5 neighbors that did not survive. So I can't stress enough the importance of defensible space. Okay, and that's my presentation.
Thanks so much, Christopher. As Quinn mentioned earlier, my name is MaryJo. I am hoping people can hear me. Please let me know if that's not the case. So today I will be talking first about insurance issues and ways that wineries can prepare for a potential wildfire in the context of insurance. And I think the most important thing I could say in this section is to encourage you to reach out to your broker and your insurance lawyer early and work with them closely to determine what makes the most sense for you in your fact-specific scenario, because every insurance policy is different and every winery and every grower's need is different. The first thing I wanted to mention is to encourage you to update your insurance limits. So again, this is an area where it's very important to work with your broker early and closely to determine your individual needs and what your policy already covers. But 2 issues to keep in mind generally is that costs, both material costs and labor costs, can increase after a natural disaster like a wildfire. And so that's something that should be kept in mind when reviewing your insurance limits, because the rate that you negotiated may no longer be sufficient after the increase in demand affects prices after a potential wildfire. And then the other thing to keep in mind, I mean, we all know it happens, but at least for me, it's easy to forget, is inflation. So if your insurance policy has not been negotiated in a few years or has not been looked at, that's another thing to perhaps keep in mind. Please slide. Thank you. The other thing I wanted to touch on is making a claim. So right now, it'd be good to look at your policy, actually take it out and read through the requirements that you would need to fulfill in order to make a claim in the case of a potential wildfire. And review this with your broker if necessary, review this with your lawyer, and figure out what your specific policy requires. Now, some general issues to keep in mind is, first, the distinction between property insurance and crop insurance. So depending on the policy, property insurance usually covers things like buildings, wine and cellars, grapes that have already been harvested. Crop insurance, on the other hand, usually covers things like the vines and the grapes that are still on them. And crop insurance is usually limited in scope with what it covers, and then also in the amount that it will cover. And the other thing to keep in mind is timing. So some policies will require that a grower or a winery file a claim pretty soon after they determine that there has been damage to their property or suspect that there has been damage. So for example, this often comes up in the context of crop insurance claims. So many crop insurance claims will require that a claim be filed within 72 hours of when a grower suspects that their grapes may have been affected or know that their grapes have been affected. And usually, one way to handle this is to file a placeholder claim with the crop insurance that will allow you to basically have your claim in, and then you can withdraw it later on if you determine that you do not need that insurance. The grapes are actually fine. The problem with this is that filing with your crop insurance can have other consequences, including making it difficult or impossible to later recover from property insurance, if that's what is, the policy that should cover any damage, and could also have other business consequences. So this is a particular area in which speaking with your broker and speaking with your lawyer is very important to make sure that you make the right call, because the call needs to be made in a very short amount of time, and it's a very important call. And then the other issue is compiling evidence. So determining what evidence it is that you will need in order to successfully make your claim. Slide, please, Margaret. And we will be focused mostly on this slide with crop insurance smoke taint claims, but a note about smoke taint claims overall, independently of whether you will be filing with the crop insurance or with the property insurance. Two main factual issues that are often very important are where the grapes were when they incurred the damage. So this clearly goes to whether you can recover under crop insurance or property insurance. And then also for how long the grapes were affected by the smoke. So that's just an overall concern. Now with crop insurance specifically, usually 3 different things are required. A grower would first need to have pre-harvest test results. So these are test results that look for specific molecules that are thought to indicate smoke taint issues in grapes, and these are conducted before the actual harvest. Now this can be done in one of 2 ways. So the grower can either submit berry clusters in which the actual physical berries are sent to the lab. And in that case, ETS Laboratories, which is one of the main labs in this space, recommends that the grower submits the berries cold, so under ice, undamaged, and as close to harvest as possible. And then another way this can be done is through microfermentations, which are also called bucket fermentations, where grapes are harvested from particular lots and put into a bucket, and then basically a small fermentation is started. And anecdotally, apparently the samples that are sent in as microfermentations get results back quicker than the ones that are sent in as like the actual berry clusters. So that's step 1. The second step is that the grower will also need to have post-fermentation test results. And these test results must show levels of free guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol that are above a 0.5 ppb. And the important thing to keep in mind about this is even if the pre-harvest test results did not quite meet this threshold, as long as the post-harvest test results meet the threshold, then the grower will have a claim. 2 things to note is that the pre-harvest test is still required, and also the juice or wine must be segregated from wine from other sources. And then the third component is that a grower will need to show a formal rejection from the winery. Now, you may have noticed that in the context of crop insurance specifically, I kept referring to the grower, And that's because a winery that contracts with a grower for 100% of its grapes will not itself be able to directly file a crop insurance smoke taint claim. Slide, please. So one big issue that is becoming more and more of an issue every day is the topic of non-renewals. So as many as 100 of the Sonoma County Farm Bureau's 400 members have been handed non-renewals, and it's also a widespread problem in Napa. Now, California is trying to address this in part through legislation. So California currently has what is referred to as the FAIR Plan, which stands for Fair Access to Insurance Requirements. And usually this serves as the state insurance of last resort, both for residential and commercial properties. However, as of now, it cannot apply to agricultural properties, and many wineries are classified as farms. So SB 11, a bill that is currently working its way through the California legislature, aims to broaden California FAIR Plan to apply to farms and by extent also to wineries that are classified as farms. And this will hopefully help provide some stopgap insurance for these wineries that have otherwise been handed non-renewals. Now, the California FAIR Plan is very limited, not only what it provides coverage for, but then also the amount. For example, it provides a max of $3 million for buildings, but it would be something that would hopefully be available to wineries if this bill gets passed. And then one other policy proposal that is gaining traction and that we see again and again is a push for property insurance to be permitted to exclude wildfire risk. And although this seems a bit counterintuitive, the thinking behind it is that if property insurance companies are told you are allowed to exclude wildfire risk, but cover the wineries for everything else, then they would at least give wineries the option of being insured for things other than wildfire risk. And so wineries wouldn't be put in a position where they have no insurance, period. And I think the main takeaway from all of this is that this is a large issue, it's a complicated issue, and it probably just needs to be solved through legislation and hopefully will be soon. Slide, please, Margaret. Now, one thing we got a lot of questions about was working through the smoke. And in this slide, I would just like to go through some potential things to keep in mind as you try to make a plan for doing so. The first one is to determine which employees can easily work remotely and implement a system to facilitate this. So make sure they have the technology they would need now. Make sure that you have an efficient way of communicating with your employees, whether that be, an email message thread or some other sort of list where you have them categorized. Like, these are the employees that may need to come in, these are the employees that will not. And in this way, you can efficiently and effectively get information out to them in the short time frame that a wildfire usually provides. The other thing to determine is which employees will not be able to work during the smoke. And the key thing about this is to make sure that you do not ask about underlying medical diagnoses or conditions. What you are trying to determine is medical restrictions. So one way to do this perhaps would be to send a general email to all employees laying out the plan that the winery has for working through the fire, and then asking employees that have restrictions on their ability to work through the smoke to contact HR or some other contact person, and then work with those employees one-on-one to determine accommodations, etc. And at that point, especially if you want to decide that the accommodations are not feasible, or you want to decide to terminate the employee because they cannot work through the smoke, we encourage you to definitely reach out to your lawyer before making those decisions and making sure that you talk it through with them. Then another thing to consider is the process for obtaining permits to access areas under mandatory evacuation. So if your winery or your vineyard gets put under mandatory evacuation, knowing who it is you need to call, knowing what the process is like to be able to gain access to these areas if any permits are being given out, so that crucial winery and vineyard operations can continue even through the evacuation. Another thing to consider is buying a backup generator and ensuring you have enough fuel to run it. And then finally, having PPE on hand for workers that do come in and are working through the smoke to enable them to better do so and to do so as safely as possible. And those are my notes. Thank you. On to Quinn.
Thanks, MaryJo. So I'm going to be talking about grape purchase agreements. A lot of the issues also apply to vineyard leases that have pricing determined by either grapes harvested or the market value of grapes grown or acreage, things like that. So during summer right now, when we aren't actually in harvest, when we don't really have fires going yet or not major fires that are a threat, one of the big things you can do is to understand what your agreements say. If we actually get into a situation where there is a fire, where there is smoke damage, it's a hectic time. Staffs on both the grower and the winery are likely to be shorthanded. And so you don't want to be scrambling then to try to figure out what each party's obligations are. It's better to know going into harvest what the obligations are. And so that starts by reviewing your existing grape purchase agreements. I know they're legal documents, they're sometimes dense, not fun to read, but still try to take a look at them, particularly provisions related to acceptance and rejection of fruit, what condition the fruit needs to be in, whether there are kind of specific thresholds for anything, even just whether there's a general standard, and then see if the agreement says anything about resolving disagreements over the quality of fruit or disagreements over acceptance or rejection. Once you understand what the agreements say, you have an opportunity to try to clarify the existing agreements. So that would either be working with your counterparty, either the grower or the winery, to amend the agreements, or even just if you identify gaps or ambiguities, just kind of come up with an understanding for what to do if there is a fire, if there is potential smoke damage. The uncertainty, a lot of grape purchase agreements are ambiguous or uncertain about what exactly happens. And that uncertainty is often a negative for both the grower and the winery. From the winery's perspective, you might be in a situation where you think your only option is to reject the fruit. And if that happens, rejecting fruit that's usable is not good for either party. It means the fruit might go to waste. It's not going to go to its highest and best use. It's just a net value loss. So because of that, it really can benefit both sides to have a clear process. Wineries don't want to pay for fruit that they won't be able to turn into wine that they can sell. They also don't want to pay for the cost of processing fruit that's not going to be usable. On the flip side, growers don't want to incur cost to harvest fruit if the winery is going to reject it. And if they know the winery is going to reject fruit, they'd like to be able to go and try to sell it somewhere else. So all of those are just factors that incentivize both sides to have a clear process in the document. Sometimes that may require amending the agreement. If it's a friendly relationship, if you guys are doing it collaboratively, both sides will likely be open to doing an amendment. Next slide, please, Margaret. So in terms of understanding the agreement, the contract language governs most of the time. There are some provisions that, even though they're written in the contract, they might not be enforceable. There are certain California rights under California law that can be waived, certain provisions that just the state has said, nope, that's too one-sided, we aren't going to allow it. So the overlay behind what the contract actually says is the UCC. So grapes are a good that are subject to Article 2 of the California UCC. Article 2 of the California UCC contains a lot of provisions, a lot of detail on sort of baseline rules for buying and selling fruit. So in addition to what the agreement says, it helps to have a general understanding of the UCC. Next slide, please. All right, so the main rules that come up, the main default rules that apply to grape purchase agreements are California Agricultural Code 55873. This essentially says a winery cannot reject grapes without reasonable cause. That's a fuzzy standard. Reasonable cause is pretty amorphous, but it does mean that there needs to actually be a reason. Parties might fight about what that reason is, but there needs to be a reason. The UCC also imposes 2 implied warranties. These can be waived in a grape purchase agreement, but grape purchase agreements rarely include waivers of these provisions or of these implied warranties. The first is the implied warranty of merchantability. This is a fairly broad warranty. It's just essentially warranting that the grapes are saleable. So that would likely mean just that they can be turned into some wine that could be sold, not turned into wine of a particular quality or wine that could be sold under a certain label or program. The second and more relevant implied warranty is implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. So this is something where the grower is acknowledging that, yes, the winery intends to use this fruit for a specific product. This can be accomplished by things like the winery intends to use the grapes for premium wine or ultra premium wine or luxury wine or similar words like that. Many grape purchase agreements, especially more recent ones, especially for vineyards in Napa and Sonoma, include recitals or statements like this, where the grower acknowledges that winery intends to use the grapes for production of yada yada. If the grape purchase agreement includes a provision like that, it will trigger the implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose, which means when judging whether the grapes are acceptable, they will be subject to that higher standard. And that has a lot of implications for acceptance because, I mean, I don't know a ton about winemaking practices for dealing with smoke taint, but I understand like there are a number of ways you can treat grapes to try to reduce smoke taint, but that also strips out a lot of the positive characteristics that you need for premium wine. So grapes that could be treated in that manner might still be merchantable because you could still turn them into some wine, but they wouldn't meet this implied warranty for use as luxury or super premium wine. Next slide, Margaret. So here are a little bit more detail on some of the default rules under the UCC. The net takeaway of all of this is it ends up being a jumble. So under the UCC, the winery does not have the right to conditionally accept. So you can't say you're accepting subject to it turning out to be okay. But you are allowed to have a reasonable opportunity to inspect, which means you can receive it and then say, hey, there's this issue that I couldn't tell earlier, so now I'm going to try to reject it. It's a little fuzzy that the standards for when you can reject under each circumstance are a little different. The main takeaway is you don't want to be relying on what the UCC says. It would be better if the agreement actually has a process. Next slide, please, Margaret. All right, so here are some potential frameworks for how to address this in a grape purchase agreement. Again, similar things could go in a vineyard lease. So you could spell out in the agreement what the testing framework is in advance. You could do that by either referencing specific thresholds, like what MaryJo said with 0.5 ppb of free guaiacol, I don't say that right, or 4-methyl guaiacol. One issue with that is there is still a lot of research that needs to be done on smoke taint, on the effect of smoke taint on wine. So these thresholds are evolving, and I don't think there is a clear consensus on what levels of these compounds or what levels of other compounds create smoke taint or create negative characteristics in finished wine. So because of that, having a definitive threshold, definitive standards might not be viable. You could try to do it by referencing kind of an evolving standard, and maybe as we learn more, as more research is done, I could see TS or Davis or some of the Australian universities kind of establishing clearer standards and updating them from year to year as they learn more. So it might be possible to reference something like that as a measurable standard. Another option is to have, so setting up testing framework would kind of just be a black and white. It can be rejected if it's above blank, it can't be rejected if it's below blank. You could also have something where you build in tiered pricing. So if there's some smoke taint or some risk of smoke taint, you could say the price drops by X percentage. And again, you could tie this to thresholds that are testable. Another option is to have pricing tied to kind of post-fermentation test results, either specific kind of chemical analysis or sensory evaluations. If you're doing sensory evaluations, it gets more subjective. That gets a little tricky, but it is possibly a more functional workaround given that the standards and the science is still evolving. Something to keep in mind, if you go with pricing based, apologies, I have a kid homesick from school and he's trying to get into the room. So if I need to step away, give me a moment. So if you have pricing determined based on post-fermentation tests and try to change the price, then you can run into issues with the Berryhill Act, which requires that all grapes sold have a definitive price by January 10th of the following year. So you've really only got a couple months to figure that out. I think there's some ambiguity as to how the Berryhill Act is enforced on things like this, but it's better to just try to get the price nailed down earlier. A final option is to require the winery to accept the fruit, but say that if it turns out that the wine is not usable for the winery's program, the winery could have just been processing the fruit on the grower's behalf. An advantage of that is it allows the fruit to still be turned into wine. So the grower isn't forced to just drop the fruit or not sell it at all. Presumably it being turned into wine is going to be a more valuable use of that fruit. So this is a way to essentially wait and see what actually happens while also reducing both parties' downside risk. So the winery isn't forced to pay full purchase price for fruit it can't use. The grower is not forced to just take a complete loss on the fruit. So that is what I have. I rushed through this a little bit to try to leave some time for questions.